Good afternoon. I'm Margaret Sullivan, the media columnist for The Washington Post. I'm happy to be hosting the first segment of our program. The subject is Media, Politics, and Speech in the Digital Era. Joining me on stage to kick off our discussion, Floyd Abrams, Senior Counsel at Cahill Gordon. Mr. Abrams is an expert in First Amendment and media litigation. His new book, titled The Soul of the First Amendment, was released in April. Jameel Jaffer is the executive director of Columbia University's Knight First Amendment Institute, which seeks to preserve First Amendment rights in the digital age. Mr. Jaffer previously served as the deputy legal director of the ACLU and its Center for Democracy. Ross LaJeunesse, global head of international relations for Google. Mr. LaJeunesse oversees Google's efforts to advance a free and open internet space around the world. Thank you all for joining us. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our audience in the room and those watching online that you can tweet questions to us using the hashtag #PostLive or leave them in the comments section of our Facebook live stream. If I find them, I will pose them, some of them, to our panelists, assuming we have time. So let's get started. Just like to set the stage a little bit by saying that just 1 year ago, things were quite different in many ways in this realm. Gawker was still publishing. Donald Trump was not yet the Republican nominee for president. Chelsea Manning was still serving a 35-year prison term for her massive leaks of sensitive government documents. Facebook Live had not yet been used to capture the immediate aftermath of Philando Castile's shooting by a Minnesota police officer. So we live in a different world now, changed by technology and politics. So I'd like to start with Floyd. Your book is called The Soul of the First Amendment. How worried are you and why about the state of the First Amendment at this moment?
Some months ago, I made the mistake of saying to a journalist that I thought that we might be in for the worst time since John Adams sought to and then got Congress to adopt the Sedition Act of 1798. Looking back on it, I think that's so far an overstatement, but I am concerned about it. I'm concerned about it both in light of the daily denigration of the press by the president and the impact that I believe that has had on public opinion about the press, even at its best. And I'm concerned in a few areas in particular: the potential use of the Espionage Act, the potential effort to get journalists to reveal their sources, areas such as that. It's still early, and we really just don't know where we'll be next year at this time. But that's my starting point.
Jameel, let's turn to the political. Your Knight Center has written to the White House very recently about President Trump's blocking Twitter users, making the case, if I understand it correctly, that this is a First Amendment transgression. Would you explain and tell us how successful you think this can be and how you might follow it up?
Sure. Well, there's a case that was decided yesterday by the Supreme Court called Packingham, which is, among other things, a recognition of the importance that social media now plays in our public debates, public discourse. A lot of things that used to take place in town halls or on the sidewalks now take place on social media. Those kinds of conversations now take place on social media. And the question of how the First Amendment ought to be applied in that context is an increasingly important one. I think it's fair to see President Trump as a kind of social media president in the same way that JFK was the TV president and FDR was the radio president. It's Trump's use of social media raises the same kinds of fundamental questions about the way that the First Amendment ought to work in this new realm. And the argument we're making is that President Trump's Twitter account is a kind of public forum. People can respond to the president's tweets. People can engage one another about the president's tweets. The president uses his Twitter account for official purposes to announce, for example, who he intends to nominate as FBI director, or to engage with foreign governments or foreign leaders. He uses it all the time in an official way. And the president is certainly entitled to a personal Twitter account if he wants one. He could have a closed account, invite only his friends or family to join the account. But if a government official throws open an environment for expression, uses the environment in the way that President Trump is using this one, I think it's the bedrock principle of First Amendment jurisprudence that the government can't then exclude people from that forum on the basis of their viewpoints. So I don't think that there's any, room for debate about the legal principles here. These are principles that have been established, for 50, 70 years. But the application of those principles in this new context is obviously something new. I think it's really important. Social media really does have the significance that the Supreme Court said it did yesterday. And I suspect that there'll be many other cases involving the way that the First Amendment should apply to social media over the next few years. You asked what we intend to do. Well, the hope obviously was that President Trump was going to reverse the blocking of his critics. He hasn't done that.
The minute he got your letter.
The minute he got our letter. He may yet do that. If he doesn't, we are an institute that is set up for litigation, and litigation is certainly an option.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Ross, one thing that didn't quite make my list, but we were talking about in the green room, was that the term fake news wasn't much in the conversation a year ago. It certainly is now. Can you tell me how Google is handling this and what your responsibilities are in this area?
Sure. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.
Fake news is one of those terms which has become so loaded that I think it's important to first define what it is we're talking about explicitly.
I've stopped using it myself, but
right.
it's a shorthand.
I honestly think it's a term that has fallen from the weight of its own overuse and obliqueness, for lack of a better word. But we do know and feel that as Google we have a responsibility and an awareness that many of our products and platforms are used for free expression purposes and for the exchange of ideas. And we take that responsibility pretty seriously. When it comes to the issue of fake news, generally, there was a decision that we would do more to identify specific sites, the only purpose of which was to advance untruths, was an initial take on it. It's a difficult issue because, we don't live in a Manichaean society where everything is completely clear in black and white. At what point does an argument about facts turn into a debate about philosophy and about interpretation? So we've been fairly thoughtful, or tried to be very thoughtful about how we approach that issue. But, another very important element for us is that we want people to be using our search engine, for example, as a way of finding the information they want. And to the extent they were feeling overwhelmed or overloaded by advertisers, or like I said, by sites whose only purpose was to peddle, blatantly false facts. Margaret Sullivan and Ross LaJeunesse are married and living in Houston.
There you go. That's not true.
That's not true.
More fake news.
So, it is a difficult issue, but that's the first step we've tried to take in addressing it. And it's been particularly interesting to see politicians try and use that nomenclature as a way of basically shutting down critics and journalists. But that, is a much more difficult issue. The last thing I wanted to say is we're a huge believer in counter speech, this idea, which I think is at the heart of the United States as a free society, that the way you answer speech you don't agree with or you don't like is more speech. You don't shut down the speech you don't like. When you focus on counter speech, that's how the truth eventually comes out.
And let me stay with you for a moment. Let's talk about Google and privacy concerns. A writer for Salon way back in 2014, which was a different era altogether, described Google's corporate ethos as all data it can grab is Google's for the taking. Privacy groups have asked US regulators to review changes that Google has made to its privacy policies, allowing more thorough profiles of users to be built. How can consumers feel comfortable at a time when this kind of thing is going on, and what kinds of measures need to be taken?
Sure. Our approach to data is an acknowledgement first that one of the key reasons that people use and enjoy our services is because they do use data to make them work better. That said, we certainly don't view a user's data as something we own. We've been very clear from the start that a user owns his or her own data. So our approach has been this. If you want to use Google services anonymously or not signed in as a user, you are free to do that. They're not going to work as well, quite frankly. If you're searching on maps and you're not signed in as a user and you're searching pizza, you might get the Wikipedia entry for pizza and its origins, or any number of responses that generally aren't helpful. This is the example I use because when I'm signed in and I'm using Maps or Google Search and I'm walking down 14th Street and I'm searching pizza, the services then know, chances are Ross is looking for a place to eat pizza. Let's serve up those results first. But I digress a little bit. The first element is if you don't have to be signed in or give us any data if you use our services. If you do sign in and are using our services, our approach has been transparency, control, and the ability to walk away. So we have very clear language about the data that we collect on our users. I acknowledge that the vast majority of our users never look at it and don't understand it. Privacy policies are very complicated, and the reason they're complicated, as much as we'd like to simplify them, is because privacy regulators often dictate the exact requirements and the language that we have to use. And many of the times that we've come to disagreement is because we are trying to simplify the privacy language and data protection authorities around the world won't allow us to do so. But we do provide that transparency. And in fact, we have a dashboard, if you are a signed-in user, where you can go and you can see exactly the data, precisely the data that's being collected and how we're using it. And then we give you control. You can say, no, I don't want you to collect that data. No, I don't want those types of services or ads to be served to me. No, I don't like the fact that you might know that I'm often searching in this geographic area because that makes me uncomfortable. You can get rid of that. So that's the control element. And then the final thing that we've done is we've spent a lot of engineering time to make it incredibly useful to walk away and take your data with you. Basically, I think it's 2 clicks when you go to that dashboard. Like, what Google is creeping me out. I don't want to use this anymore. I want to go somewhere else. A couple clicks, we package that data for you, and it's an export function.
See if you can get along without us, right?
Well, I don't want to, that sounds far too flippant because we survive on the trust of our users, honestly, and that's a key driver for us. When users start to feel, they know too much about me, I'm not comfortable, I don't want to do this anymore, then we've lost their trust and they do go somewhere else. So that's the approach that we take.
Okay. Staying in the world of technology, Jameel, your whole center was really set up because we live in such a different era now, and the First Amendment and speech issues have changed so much at a time when millions of sensitive documents can be distributed across the world in an instant. How does that change the way we think about free speech today, and what are the kinds of issues that you deal with?
Yeah, well, I think that some of the most significant threats to free speech today don't take the form that we're accustomed to. They don't take the form of a government official saying, you can't publish that piece of information. Instead, what you have is increasingly pervasive government surveillance, increasingly pervasive surveillance by private entities as well. And that kind of surveillance has a less direct, but nonetheless real effect on what people are willing to say or publish, who they're willing to associate with. That's a very hard thing to get a handle on. It's a hard thing to measure. It's not even clear who has the tools to measure it, except in very narrow contexts. That doesn't mean it's not real, right? I think even now, if you ask a 14-year-old kid what he or she is willing to search for online, you may find that this kid is going to hesitate before searching for information about politically sensitive issues or information about medical conditions or sexual information. People hesitate, and they hesitate because they know somebody is watching or somebody could be watching. And it's very difficult to measure that kind of hesitation. But over time, those hesitations, those small hesitations, change the way that we relate to one another and change the way we relate to the government. So I think of government surveillance and private surveillance as a serious threat to free speech that we're only beginning to get our hands around right now. You mentioned that new technology allows leakers to disseminate huge volumes of information very, very quickly, and that's true. New technology also allows the government to track those people, to identify the people who are leaking the information much more easily, to identify the reporters who are talking to people who think of themselves as whistleblowers, often are whistleblowers.
We have a recent case of that when Reality Winner.
Right, Reality Winner is a recent case of that, right? And you may think that in many cases, whistleblowers or self-styled whistleblowers aren't in fact whistleblowers. But most people recognize that in some circumstances, it's a good thing that people who work for the government disclose information that the government more generally doesn't want disclosed. And if you think that there are circumstances in which it's a good thing, then you should think about the effect that all of this new technology in the hands of government investigators is going to have on the willingness and ability of those government employees to release information when it ought to be released. So I think that it's a very serious threat to free speech that people don't always think of as a threat to free speech. It's a result of the availability of new technology, the inexpensiveness of new technology. There's a case that the Supreme Court just granted cert on a few days ago called Carpenter, which involves the right of the government to access stored location information. So to find out where you've been over time by looking at your cell phone data. And people think of this as a privacy case, and it is arguably the most important privacy case that the court has taken in a generation. But it's also a very significant First Amendment case, even if the First Amendment is never mentioned. It's a very important case relating to the power of the government to obtain information about First Amendment activity, who you met with, who you spoke to, where you were. All of that, has immediate bearing on your First Amendment rights. So I think that this is true more generally, that some of the most important First Amendment cases over the next generation will be at the intersection of the First Amendment and privacy, the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment.
Floyd, how do you think, since you are the person whose name comes to mind when people hear the words First Amendment attorney in our country, what do you think the founders would have, how well would they think the First Amendment holds up in our digital age? And is it is it equipped to hold up in this age?
First, I think the founders would be stunned at the breadth of First Amendment protection as it exists today.
More than they intended?
Because they couldn't foresee the future, they couldn't intend it one way or the other is the problem. And I think that trying to think back to what we know about what they thought then, it's, you know, it wasn't many years ago then what you do for a living would have been unthinkable. So when you talk about the 18th century and what would they have thought, I mean, what they gave us was a very broadly written document, a document opposed by people like Alexander Hamilton, other, you know, great leaders of the country who didn't want a Bill of Rights, who didn't think we needed one. I mean, the more the new technology comes into play, the more we need the First Amendment, not the less, both to protect it and to distinguish, I would say, the role of the government from the role of private entities, as to which the First Amendment doesn't apply. I mean, they have First Amendment protection. They are First Amendment players, but they're not the government. And the First Amendment limits, of course, only the government. So it's you know, really difficult to think, except in this one way at least, about what the framers would have thought. I think they would have wanted a very broad reading of the rights, and they wouldn't have known what the responsibilities would be, but the rights of the Googles of the world to gather information and disseminate it as they thought best, leaving, of course, all the hard issues for the future.
Floyd, staying with you for a moment, does free speech mean extending a hand to the most offensive speech out there?
I wouldn't say extending a hand. Free speech means barring the government from limiting most communication of one sort or another, and included in the most in America, and hence free speech, hence First Amendment, is outrageous, offensive, more than off-putting, racist speech, which every other Western democratic country would deem criminal. I mean, I've cited in my book statements of Donald Trump when he ran for president. What he said about Muslims and Mexicans was very controversial. In Europe, it would have been a crime because of their hate speech laws. And a good deal of what occurs and what is said in a political context, a social context, and the like here would not be protected speech in Canada or England. I'm not talking about Russia now. I'm talking about great democratic countries that care about free expression but don't have anything like the level of legal protection for it that we have.
Where do you think the line should be drawn?
I think the line ought to be drawn, at least for us, and I do distinguish us from countries that have gone through very different histories. I don't criticize Germany for making it illegal to deny the Holocaust, or India to crack down on certain language which has caused communal violence in the past. But here, I think the bounds ought to be as sweepingly broad. And yesterday's opinions, by the way, by the Supreme Court illustrate that. All but unanimous opinions of the court in areas where the public might well come out the other way, whether we can keep a convicted sex offender from going online in areas where children can go online, held unconstitutional by the court in a sweepingly broad opinion dealing with the nature of the new communication media that we have in this country and the need to protect it. So I would keep it very broad. Sure, we have exceptions, incitement to criminal conduct. There are some things, of course, we define as not speech, even though they're words. I mean, spying is illegal everywhere, here too. Libel is not protected here. We give more protection for speech against libel laws here than anywhere in the world, but we have libel law, we have privacy law, but we limit them, we cabin them all because of the First Amendment and because of our sense that we're not prepared to risk that level of government involvement and ultimately government censorship, which could otherwise overcome us.
Jameel, how do you take on that question? Where, if at all, should a line be drawn?
I think I ultimately come out where Floyd comes out. I don't find it an easy question at all. I grew up in Canada. I think Canada has a very healthy democracy, and it draws a line somewhere different. So it doesn't seem obvious to me that the sky is going to fall if we draw the line somewhere differently. I also feel like Floyd does, that other countries have made understandable judgments about where to draw the line, where to draw their lines based on their own histories. But it's not like we don't have our history, and we have our own history here. And we ought to learn from our history in the same way that those countries have learned from their histories. So I've never been somebody to whom it was obvious that we should protect hate speech to the extent that we do protect it. To me, the best argument for protecting it is that the alternatives seem worse. I'm not enthusiastic about giving the government the authority to decide which views are sufficiently hateful and which ones aren't. I think that those judgments would have been made differently 20 years ago than they would be made today, and they might be made differently 20 years from now than they are today. But I think that it's dangerous I don't mean to suggest that that Floyd was doing this, but it's dangerous not to recognize the cost of the line that we draw. These words are not costless. The words really do cause real harms. They make it more likely that people will get hurt in the real world. And people do get hurt in the real world because of the words that we use. So we shouldn't, I don't think that we should take for granted that the line that we've drawn is the right line. I don't think that we should think that speech is free in this particular sense. This is not, again, a response to anything that Floyd said. But ultimately, because I don't know what the alternative is, I don't know what what palatable alternative might be out there. I'm more comfortable with the line that we've drawn, that the Supreme Court has drawn, than I am with any other that I can think of.
And I'll ask you the same question.
One thing we need to consider is that if we were to move to a model where hate speech is outlawed, for example, you're not doing anything to address the underlying animosity at issue. I'm an openly gay man, and I would rather know if someone hates me because of my sexual orientation than to not know. Mm-hmm. And especially if that person is a government official with the power of the state behind him or her. I want to know that so that I can act accordingly, take whatever actions I feel I need to take to protect myself and my community. I've had this conversation with civil society in parts of Europe, and we've had a pretty healthy debate over that very issue, and the view there is that there's a sense of a public forum which must be kept sacrosanct and that it's sullied when certain words are spoken. And I understand that, and I agree that it's not my place to judge a different country's system given their own history and their own beliefs. But as an American and as someone who was raised in this country and in this environment, that's always been my view, that I'd rather know if someone is hateful, because at least then there's an opportunity to engage and try and change hearts and minds, even if you're not going to be successful at that. So that's one, that's one element to this that I think we need to consider. The other thing is there's really excellent work by this woman. She's a professor at American University, Susan Benish, and her project is about not hate speech, but dangerous speech. What is the speech, the words, the coda that predictably indicate that someone is going to take the next step into violent acts, some form of acting on those beliefs? And it's really interesting work. It informs a lot of how we view it at Google, our approach to our own platforms. But that's a different set of considerations than what we were just describing. Most hate speech does not lead to violence or acts. So perhaps another reason to be very cautious in taking a different approach than what we've taken already.
And I add, too, that I think there's almost a strategic reason, at least for us, to continue down the road that we're on. I mean, when you think back to Weimar Germany, they had hate speech laws then. They tried Nazis for engaging in hate speech before the Nazis took power. Goering was tried on that charge on the Weimar Republic. And it got them more publicity, and it made them better known, and it didn't limit the speech. And I think that is one of the lessons of history.
So it's better to know and to have it out there.
Yeah, and denounce it. I mean, there is counter speech too. What you were talking about.
I think that's a really important point. That it forces us to articulate our disagreement with those views, and that effort at explaining why those views are offensive is an effort that has a payoff of many different kinds. But one of the payoffs is to sort of galvanize the forces of resistance to those ideas. I think you've seen a little bit of that even over the last 9 months. I think that's a very important function that the First Amendment serves sort of indirectly by putting the burden on ordinary citizens to make the judgment for themselves of what speech is valuable and what speech should be beyond the pale. For all the problems that come with the First Amendment, that's a very important benefit of that principle.
Because you're on a university campus and there will be other people speaking at this event more specifically about this, but how well do you think young people understand and subscribe to these kinds of principles that we're talking about? Is there a good, solid understanding, or is there a tendency to want to protect and back away from free speech?
The polling data is bad, depressing, dismal.
Tell us about that.
Well, when you look at the data, and 40% of I'm trying to think if I have the right year, but 40% of entering college students in one very recent year, having said on the one hand they're all for the First Amendment, then say that they agree with the proposition that people on campus shouldn't say things which make other people feel bad, and that colleges ought to do something to prevent or punish when that sort of thing occurs. It seemed to me for some time that we lost a lot in this country when we stopped teaching civics in junior high school. An awful lot of people, a lot of good, wonderful young people reach college without having touched the U.S. Constitution on the way.
Jameel, where are you on that?
I guess, I see the same incidents that everybody else sees, the highly publicized incidents at Middlebury, at, a few other colleges, Berkeley. It's plain that in those cases, there are students who were unwilling to listen to ideas that made them uncomfortable, reacted in precisely the wrong ways to controversial or offensive speech. And I think that those are incidents in which something went wrong. Whether there is, some sort of epidemic of, repression going on across the country, I guess I'm not willing to, to say that. My own very limited experience at Columbia is a very positive one. My sense is that the students are very open to hearing ideas that they disagree with, to engaging with ideas they disagree with, and with offensive ideas. Columbia may not be representative, I don't know. And my experience at Columbia may not be representative, but my experience thus far has been very positive. I also do think that, you need to disentangle a few different things here. And it may well be true that students are less enthusiastic about the First Amendment than they used to be in a way that's problematic. I think it is also true that students are, maybe for the first time, students at American universities are really grappling with the costs of some of this speech. And I think anyone who is going to defend the
What do you mean when you say the costs?
The way that the speech has consequences in the real world. So when President Trump is saying on national TV that Mexicans, when he's denigrating Mexicans or Muslims or whatever the group is, there are real costs in the real world. There's violence in the real world that at the margins, people are more likely to carry out because of speech like that. And so I think that if you're going to defend free speech, and I want to defend free speech, and at the end of the day, I think the right answer is to protect all of this speech. But if you're going to take that position, you need to grapple with the costs of the speech. And you don't want to be oblivious to the very real effects that speech has in the real world.
What does the grappling look like?
Well, so part of it is acknowledging it. Just acknowledging that the speech isn't costless. That speech has effects in the real world. That's why we protect it, because it's powerful, because it can be powerful. That's why it's worth protecting. But for precisely the same reasons it's worth protecting, it can be dangerous. And that doesn't mean that we should suppress it. But it's something that those of us who advocate for broad protection have to, at the very least, acknowledge and I think incorporate into our advocacy for broad protection of free speech.
I wanted to build on Floyd's point about citizenship. I personally agree with him, and I actually have been thinking a lot about digital citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen in a digitally enabled world? And we're doing a lot of that work at Google, but it's, going to schools all around the country, teaching the basics. But when I think about, the lessons that I learned growing up in rural Maine, don't take candy from strangers, look both ways before you cross the road, some basic rules of survival. And I think about the world that we're going to be moving into and how underlying all of it is technology and communications. It's really a digital world. And we're just not doing enough to teach kids how to navigate that world. Don't believe everything you read. What does phishing look like? There's a lot of crap out there that, isn't true, how to deal with fake news. And I think we really need to tackle this issue, because if we don't, we're not only going to have kids who don't know the Constitution, they're not going to know really the basics of making their way in this world that is going to be incomprehensible to them. Like I said, we're doing a lot, but it's a lot of it can be done at home. Like my sister with her kids, you don't take the laptop into your room by yourself. It's monitored. The time they're on screens is limited. There's some basic things that I'd like to see schools do a little bit more in preparing us all for that.
So you don't think it's enough for someone to say, I read it on the internet?
No.
Not quite enough.
No, not
Okay, well, great. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to thank Floyd Abrams, Jameel Jaffer, and Ross LaJeunesse for joining me for this discussion. Up next, I'd like to welcome my colleague Nick Anderson to the stage. He'll be moderating our next panel on free speech on college campuses, which we've just touched on a bit, but they'll get into in a deeper way. So thank you very much.